The grand chamber of Station Harmony floated in the darkness of space like a monument to galactic pride. Inside its massive halls, representatives from 12 elder species sat on elevated platforms, looking down at the smaller delegations below. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the human section with his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, diplomat Laura Bennett tapped her fingers on the armrest of her chair, a nervous habit she had developed over the past 3 years of endless council meetings. Commander Rick Hayes sat on Jake's other side, his military uniform pressed and perfect, but his eyes showed the same frustration that Jake felt. This was the 407th session that Jake had attended since humanity joined the Galactic Council 20 years ago. 20 years of hope, cooperation, and increasingly bitter disappointment. The council chamber was designed to intimidate, with its soaring ceilings and the elevated seats that made the elder species literally look down on everyone else. The Zelthari Imperium held the highest platform, their reptilian forms draped in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the chamber lights. Below them sat the Krovan Collective, insectoid beings whose compound eyes reflected the room in 1,000 tiny fragments. The Vexenar Communion occupied the religious platform, their ethereal forms barely solid, shifting between states of matter as they observed the proceedings. Ambassador Karen White stood at the speaking podium in the center of the chamber floor. She was a veteran diplomat who had spent 15 years trying to make humanity's voice heard in this place. Her hair had gone gray during her service, and the lines on her face told the story of countless rejected proposals and dismissed warnings. Today she presented evidence that her team had gathered over 6 months of investigation. The holographic display showed star charts, energy readings, and disturbing patterns in the outer reaches of known space. Colonies were disappearing. Not destroyed, not abandoned, but simply vanishing without any distress calls or explanations. Strange signals pulsed from regions that had been empty for millennia. Ships that ventured too close to certain coordinates never returned. Karen's voice remained steady as she explained each piece of evidence, building a case that something dangerous was emerging in the unexplored regions. She requested a joint investigation, offering human ships and personnel to lead the mission. The cost would be minimal, the potential benefit enormous. Early detection of threats had always been humanity's strength in the Council. High Chancellor Zorath of the Zelthari Imperium barely waited for Karen to finish before dismissing her concerns. His translator converted his hissing speech into cold, formal words that echoed through the chamber. The outer reaches were called outer for a reason, he stated. They were far from civilized space, far from anything that mattered. If some primitive colonies disappeared, it was likely due to their own incompetence. The Council had more important matters to discuss than chasing shadows in the dark corners of the galaxy. Besides, he added with what passed for a smile among his species, humans were known for seeing threats everywhere. It was a symptom of their youth as a species, this constant anxiety about the unknown. Several other council members voiced their agreement. The Krovan representative chittered about wasted resources. The Vexenar high priest spoke of divine order, and how the worthy civilizations would naturally survive while the unworthy would fade. Only 2 species, the Trill and the Merenti, spoke in support of investigating Karen's findings. Both were considered minor members of the Council, barely worth acknowledging by the elder species. Their votes counted the same as everyone else's in theory, but in practice the elder species made all real decisions. Jake watched Karen's shoulders sag slightly as the vote was called. The investigation was rejected by a margin of 9-3. The holographic evidence disappeared, dismissed as easily as turning off a light. Karen returned to the human delegation section and sat down heavily in her chair. She did not look at Jake or the others. She did not need to. They all felt the same burning frustration, but the session was not over. The council moved to the next item on the agenda, and this one made Jake's hands grip his chair's armrests until his knuckles turned white. The Krovan Collective proposed a new trade regulation that would impose a 40% tax on all goods produced in human space. The reasoning, according to the Krovan Chancellor Hevrel, was that human merchants were undercutting established trade routes with their aggressive pricing and willingness to deal with minor species. This disrupted the natural economic order. The tax would correct this imbalance and remind humanity of its place in the galactic marketplace. Laura Bennett leaned over to whisper in Jake's ear. This was the 3rd such tax proposal in 3 months. The previous 2 had passed and human trade was already suffering. This new tax would be devastating. Earth's colonies depended on trade for survival. Many were still developing and needed the income from exports to build infrastructure and support their populations. A 40% tax would make human goods too expensive for most buyers. It would strangle Earth's economy and force humanity into dependence on council charity. The vote came quickly. 10 species in favor, 2 opposed. The Trill and Marenti stood with humanity again, but their voices meant nothing against the majority. The tax was approved effective immediately. Karen stood to protest, to point out that this violated the fair trade agreements that humanity had signed when joining the council. High Chancellor Zorath cut her off with a wave of his clawed hand. The council had the authority to modify trade regulations as needed for the good of all species. If humanity disagreed, they were welcome to bring a formal complaint to the Trade Commission, which was controlled by the Croven Collective, which had just proposed the tax. The circular logic was intentional. Then came the final insult. The council voted on appointments to the Security Commission, the body that oversaw military cooperation and defense planning. Humanity had requested a seat on this commission every year for the past 10 years. Every year the request was denied. The reason given was always the same. Humanity lacked the experience and wisdom needed for such responsibility. Their military tactics were too aggressive, too unpredictable, too risky. Better to let the elder species handle security matters while humanity focused on learning and growing under council guidance. Jake had heard enough. He had listened to 20 years of condescension, dismissal, and barely veiled contempt. He had watched as every human contribution was minimized or stolen. Human medical technology now saved millions of lives across council space, but the credit went to the Vexinar communion. Human agricultural techniques had ended famines on a dozen worlds, but the Croven claimed they had developed those methods independently. Human engineers maintained half the critical systems on Station Harmony, but council officials treated them like servants. Laura Bennett surprised everyone by standing abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor in the sudden silence. She picked up her datapad and threw it onto the table in front of her. The device clattered and sparked its screen shattering. Every eye in the chamber turned to stare at her. Council sessions were formal affairs where such displays of emotion were considered barbaric. Laura did not care anymore. Her voice rang out clear and angry in the shocked silence. She told them they could keep their taxes and their security commission and their entire corrupt system. Humanity had tried to be good members of this council. They had offered friendship, cooperation, and innovation. They had asked for nothing but fair treatment and respect. Instead, they received contempt and exploitation. The council wanted humanity to know their place. Fine, they would learn exactly where humanity's place was, and it was not here in this chamber being talked down to by species who had grown fat and lazy on ancient achievements. High Chancellor Zorath began to speak, but Laura cut him off. She informed the council that she would be sending a full report to Earth's united government, with her recommendation that humanity withdraw from the Galactic Council immediately. The chamber erupted in noise. Some species laughed at the absurd threat. Others called for Laura to be removed for her outburst. A few, like the Trill ambassador, looked worried. Karen White stood and placed a hand on Laura's shoulder, not to restrain her but to show solidarity. Jake stood as well, and then Rick Hayes, and then every human in the chamber. They filed out together while council members shouted questions and demands. The massive doors of the chamber closed behind them with a deep boom that sounded like the end of something important. Jake looked at Karen and Laura and Rick and saw his own determination reflected in their faces. The message would be sent to Earth within the hour. President Helen Carter would read it along with similar reports from every human delegation across council space. The elder species had made humanity feel small and unwanted for 2 decades. Now they would learn what the galaxy looked like without humans holding it together. 3 days later, Ambassador Karen White stood before the full assembled Galactic Council one final time. The chamber was packed with representatives from all member species. Rumors had been flying since Laura's outburst, and everyone wanted to see what humanity would do. Karen held a datapad with Earth's official response transmitted just hours before. Her hands did not shake as she activated the holographic display. The message appeared in the air above her head, written in all council languages simultaneously. She read the declaration in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast chamber. The United Government of Earth hereby withdrew from the Galactic Council effective immediately. All treaties were void. All military cooperation agreements were ended. All joint research projects were terminated. All human personnel would be recalled from Council facilities within 30 days. Human space would be closed to Council ships unless specific diplomatic arrangements were made. The Council could keep their taxes and their security commission. Humanity would find its own path forward. The chamber exploded in outrage and disbelief. High Chancellor Zorith roared that humanity could not simply leave. The Krovan Chancellor demanded to know how humans dared to break their sworn agreements. The Vexinar High Priest declared it a violation of divine law. Karen waited for the noise to die down, and when it did not, she simply continued speaking. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She reminded them that humanity had kept every promise made to the Council. It was the Council that had broken faith by treating Earth as a subordinate rather than a partner. She listed every rejected proposal, every stolen innovation, every condescending dismissal. The evidence was damning, and several of the elder species shifted uncomfortably as their actions were laid bare before the full assembly. Karen's final words echoed in the sudden silence that fell. The Council had wanted humanity to know their place. Now they would learn theirs. She wished them luck in the times ahead because they would need it. Karen White placed the datapad on the podium and walked out of the chamber. She did not look back. Behind her, the Galactic Council sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. In 10,000 years of recorded history, no species had ever voluntarily left the Council. The very concept was unthinkable. Yet humanity had done the unthinkable, and as the implications began to sink in, the first seeds of fear took root in minds that had known nothing but certainty for millennia. The evacuation began within hours of Karen White's declaration. Captain Nina Torres stood on the bridge of the science vessel Horizon Dawn and watched through the main viewport as Kepler Station grew smaller behind them. The station had been a joint research facility for 8 years, a place where humans worked alongside alien scientists to unlock the mysteries of dark matter and quantum field manipulation. Nina had spent 3 of those years there, making friends with Krovan researchers and even a few Zelthari scientists who seemed less arrogant than their leaders. Now all of that was ending. The evacuation order had been clear and absolute. Every human researcher, every technician, every support staff member was to pack their personal belongings and board the transport ships. They were given 48 hours. Nina had thought it would take longer, that there would be protests or negotiations. Instead, every human on the station moved with quiet efficiency. They packed their bags, downloaded their personal research files, and walked to the docking bays without looking back. The alien scientists watched in confusion and growing alarm. Several tried to convince their human colleagues to stay, promising better treatment and more recognition for their work. None of the humans wavered. Dr. Greg Palmer had been the last to leave. He was the chief engineer who maintained Kepler Station's main computer systems. For 5 years, he had worked 18-hour days keeping the research networks running smoothly. The station's databases contained decades of collaborative research from dozens of species. Greg had designed the encryption protocols that kept all that data secure and accessible. As he boarded the Horizon Dawn, he carried a small data chip in his pocket. It contained the master encryption keys. Without those keys, most of the station's databases would become useless garbage within a week. The alien scientists did not know this yet. They would learn soon enough. Nina gave the order to depart, and her ship slipped away from Kepler Station along with 6 other human vessels. Behind them, the aliens were only beginning to understand what was happening. The research projects that depended on human expertise would stop. The experiments that required human intuition would fail. The station's computer systems would start glitching without Greg's constant maintenance. Kepler Station would not collapse immediately, but it would decay slowly like a body losing its vital organs one by one. 3 sectors away, Commander Paul Newman faced a different situation at Firebase Delta. The military installation housed a joint defense force meant to protect the border regions from pirate raids and territorial disputes. The Zelthari provided the heavy weapons and capital ships. Humans provided the tactical planning and communication systems. General Kravik of the Zelthari military had laughed when he received the evacuation notice from Earth. He informed Paul that no human would be leaving the base without Zelthari permission. The firebase was too important to galactic security. The humans could submit a formal request to the Council, and perhaps in a few months they might be allowed to rotate out their personnel in an orderly fashion. Paul had expected this response. He gave Kravik 1 hour to reconsider. The general refused. So Paul activated a series of commands that had been quietly programmed into the Firebase systems over the past 5 years. Every weapons platform, every shield generator, every sensor array suddenly went offline. The massive defense cannons that protected the installation powered down. The energy shields flickered and died. Alarm klaxons began wailing throughout the base. Zelthari technicians rushed to their stations and found their control systems completely locked out. Error messages in human languages scrolled across every screen. General Kravik stormed into the command center where Paul waited calmly with his staff. The general demanded to know what the humans had done. Paul explained in simple terms that human engineers had installed remote access protocols during routine maintenance operations. It was standard security practice to ensure systems could be repaired quickly. Now those same protocols had been used to shut down every critical system on the base. The Zelthari could try to restore functionality, but it would take their technicians weeks or months to bypass the lockouts. In the meantime, Firebase Delta was completely defenseless. Kravik's face turned a darker shade of green with rage. He threatened to arrest all the humans for sabotage. Paul pointed out that the Firebase was now unable to stop the human ships from leaving. The general could either let them go peacefully, or he could waste time trying to detain them while the base sat vulnerable to any attack. Pirates operated in this sector constantly. Without weapons or shields, the base would be an easy target. The choice was his. Kravik stared at Paul for a long moment, then stepped aside. 2 hours later, every human on Firebase Delta was aboard transport ships heading back to Earth space. Behind them, Zelthari engineers worked frantically to restore their systems and wondered how they had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. On Earth itself, President Helen Carter stood before the Planetary Assembly to address billions of watching citizens. The news of humanity's withdrawal from the Council had spread quickly, and reactions were mixed. Some celebrated the decision, tired of watching their species be treated as inferiors. Others worried about the economic consequences and potential military threats. Helen needed to unite her people behind this choice. She spoke for 90 minutes. Laying out the case for withdrawal with careful precision, she explained how the Council had systematically exploited human innovation while denying humans any real voice in galactic affairs. She showed recordings of Council sessions where human proposals were dismissed with contempt. She presented economic data, showing how Council taxes and regulations had strangled Earth's trade while enriching the elder species. She displayed military reports proving that human tactics and strategies had won dozens of conflicts, yet humans were still denied seats on the Security Commission. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Then Helen shifted her message to the future. Withdrawal from the Council did not mean isolation, she explained. It meant independence. Earth would continue to trade with species that treated humans as equals. The colonies would continue to grow and prosper without Council interference. Human military forces would protect human interests without asking permission from distant bureaucrats. Most importantly, humanity would finally be free to reach its full potential without the artificial limits imposed by species that feared competition. The economic impact hit the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Human traders like Captain Ben Crawford had spent years building networks that connected systems the major Council species ignored. Ben's ship, the Steady Hand, ran a regular route through 15 star systems inhabited by smaller civilizations that the Council deemed unprofitable. These species depended on human merchants for everything from medical supplies to farming equipment to communication devices. Ben received the recall order while docked at a Trill colony world. The Trill administrator who met him at the landing pad actually cried when Ben explained he would not be returning. Within 2 weeks, shortages began appearing throughout Council space. The Krovan Collective tried to fill the gaps left by human merchants, but their ships were larger and less efficient. They demanded higher prices and refused to deal with species that could not afford bulk orders. Smaller civilizations that had prospered under human trade suddenly faced supply crises. The Morenti colonies started rationing food. The Halcyon systems ran out of medical supplies. 36 minor species sent desperate messages to the Council demanding solutions. The Council had no solutions to offer. The frontier colonies faced even worse problems. For years, human patrol ships had protected vulnerable settlements from raiders and pirates. Lieutenants like Sophie Blake had spent months at a time in the outer systems, providing security in exchange for mining rights and research access. Sophie received her recall orders while on patrol near a Trill mining colony. She watched on her sensors as a raider ship approached the colony. Her tactical officer reminded her that their orders were clear. They were to return to Earth immediately, without engaging in any military actions on behalf of non-human populations. Sophie felt sick as she gave the order to jump away. The last thing her sensors showed was the raider ship closing in on the helpless colony. The psychological impact on Council species proved even more devastating than the physical shortages. For 20 years, humans had been everywhere in Council space, solving problems that no one else wanted to handle. They mediated disputes between minor species. They repaired failing infrastructure on neglected stations. They trained local security forces on frontier worlds. They provided medical care in regions that Council doctors refused to visit. All of that stopped in a matter of weeks. Suddenly, the elder species realized how many problems humans had been quietly managing while the Council focused on grand politics and ancient traditions. The communication network that connected all Council systems started experiencing failures. Transmissions were delayed or corrupted. Entire stations lost contact for days at a time. Technicians investigating the problems discovered that the encryption protocols were failing. Someone named Greg Palmer had designed those protocols years ago, and they required constant updates and maintenance. Greg Palmer was gone back on Earth, and he had taken his knowledge with him. The Council tried to hire new encryption experts, but qualified candidates were rare and expensive. Fixing the network would take years. A medical crisis erupted on Sanctuary Station when a virulent virus broke out among the population. The station's containment protocols failed, and the infection spread rapidly. Over 1,000 beings died in the first week. The Council sent their best doctors, but none could figure out how to stop the spread. Finally, someone checked the station records and discovered that Dr. Amy Foster had designed the containment procedures 5 years earlier, during a previous outbreak. Amy had since returned to Earth. The protocol she had written assumed regular updates and adjustments. Without her expertise, they had become obsolete. By the time the Council brought in enough specialists to contain the virus, 3,000 beings were dead. Trade route optimization collapsed. Resource management systems produced increasingly inaccurate projections. Diplomatic protocols for handling disputes between minor species were simply ignored, because no one understood them anymore. Everywhere the Council looked, they found human fingerprints. Small contributions that seemed insignificant at the time now revealed themselves as critical components of galactic civilization. Remove enough small components and eventually the whole machine stops working. On Earth, Admiral Jake Morrison monitored the situation from Strategic Command. His intelligence officers brought him hourly reports of growing chaos in Council space. 17 separate conflicts had erupted where previously there had been peace. The Council's response was always the same: send Zelthari warships to impose order through overwhelming force. This approach only made things worse, driving neutral species into rebellion and turning minor disputes into major confrontations. Jake watched the reports with grim satisfaction. The Council had treated humans like ignorant children. Now they were learning what those children had been doing all along. They had been holding the galaxy together while the adults congratulated themselves on their ancient wisdom. Lieutenant Kate Rogers entered Jake's office with the latest intelligence summary. She reported that the Council was hemorrhaging members. Smaller species were refusing to pay their dues or follow Council directives. Some were actively seeking contact with Earth, requesting new trade agreements and defense pacts. President Helen Carter had established a committee to evaluate these requests. Earth would not repeat the Council's mistakes by accepting everyone without consideration. But nor would they turn away species that genuinely sought partnership rather than domination. A new order was emerging from the chaos, and humanity stood at its center, not because they had sought power, but because they had earned trust through years of quiet competence and genuine respect for all species regardless of size or influence. The galaxy was changing, and the Council that had dismissed humanity for so long was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their error. 6 months had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the cracks that had appeared in the first weeks had become chasms. The Terminus sector burned with conflict as 3 different species fought over a system rich in rare minerals. The Valak's dominion claimed historical rights to the territory. The Shen Collective insisted they had discovered it first. The Quinn Empire simply wanted the resources and did not care about anyone's claims. Before the human withdrawal, this exact situation had occurred twice in the Terminus sector. Both times, human mediators had arrived within days and negotiated settlements that satisfied all parties. The humans had a gift for finding creative solutions that the rigid council species could never imagine. Now there were no human mediators, and the three species had gone straight to violence. The council sent a Zelthari battle fleet under the command of Admiral Torvan to resolve the crisis. The admiral had clear instructions to restore order using any means necessary. He arrived in the Terminus sector with 20 warships and immediately demanded that all three species withdraw their forces. When they refused, he opened fire on the nearest Valak's cruiser. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the system. Torvan broadcasted a message to all sides. That was what happened to those who defied council authority. The remaining forces had 1 hour to leave or face destruction. The result was catastrophic. Instead of retreating, all three species united against the common threat. They had been enemies moments before, but now they focused their combined firepower on the Zelthari fleet. The battle lasted 6 hours and left 11 Zelthari ships destroyed or crippled. Admiral Torvan barely escaped with his remaining vessels. Worse still, the conflict did not end. It spread to neighboring systems as allies of each species joined the fight. Within 3 weeks, 17 systems were engaged in active warfare. Trade routes collapsed. Refugee ships fled in all directions. The council sent more fleets, but each military intervention only escalated the violence. Admiral Chris Walker sat in Earth's Strategic Command Center and watched the updates flood in from deep space monitoring stations. His hair had gone completely gray in the past 6 months, and he had stopped trying to get more than 4 hours of sleep per night. Lieutenant Kate Rogers stood beside him reviewing the latest intelligence reports. She counted 23 separate conflicts now raging across former council space. Most were small, localized disputes over territory or resources, but they were growing. The council's response was always the same: send warships, demand compliance, destroy anyone who refused. The elder species had maintained peace for millennia through overwhelming military superiority. They had forgotten that peace built only on fear was fragile. Chris asked Kate about the human colonies. She reported that all settlements were secure and actually thriving. Without council taxes and regulations, the colonial economies had expanded rapidly. New settlements were being established in systems that the council had declared off limits. Trade with non-council species had increased by 300%. Refugee populations from council space were requesting asylum on human worlds, bringing skills and knowledge with them. Humanity was not just surviving independence. They were flourishing. The Krovan Collective faced economic disaster that made the military conflicts look minor by comparison. Their vast trade network had been the envy of the galaxy for 8,000 years. Goods flowed from production centers to markets with mathematical precision, regulated by complex algorithms that optimized every route and ensured maximum profit. The system was beautiful in its efficiency. It was also completely dependent on updates and adjustments developed by human economists over the past 15 years. Professor Dan Miller had been the lead consultant on the Krovan Trade Network. He had quietly revolutionized their entire system, using predictive models and adaptive algorithms that anticipated market changes. The Krovan had taken credit for these improvements naturally. Now Dan Miller was back on Earth teaching at the University of New Terra, and the Krovan Trade Network was dying. Chancellor Hevral of the Krovan Collective watched in horror as shipments went to the WRO. Nung destinations. Cargo holds sat empty while goods rotted in warehouses. Prices fluctuated wildly with no apparent pattern. The algorithms that had worked flawlessly for years were now producing nonsensical results. Krovan technicians tried desperately to fix the problems, but they did not understand the underlying principles. Dan Miller had built his improvements on human economic theories that the Krovan had never bothered to learn. They had simply enjoyed the profits while dismissing the source. Now those profits were evaporating. Smaller trading partners began looking elsewhere for commerce. The Krovan Collective's reputation for reliability crumbled. Within 8 months of humanity's withdrawal, Krovan trade revenues had dropped by 40% and showed no signs of recovery. Meanwhile, humanity's colonies expanded and prospered in ways that had been impossible under council rule. Admiral Jake Morrison, promoted from captain after the withdrawal, now oversaw the defensive perimeter around all human systems. Without council regulations restricting military development, human engineers had made remarkable advances. New ship designs incorporated stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to conventional sensors. Improved weapon systems could punch through shields that would have stopped older models. Better power generation meant human ships could operate longer and farther from support bases. Scientists like Dr. Rachel Stone worked around the clock to maintain humanity's technological edge. Rachel stood in her laboratory on Mars station and examined the prototype shield generator that her team had developed. It used principles that the Council had declared too dangerous to research. The elder species preferred tried and tested technology that never changed. Innovation was risky. Rachel had spent 8 years listening to Council scientists tell her that her ideas were impossible or foolish. Now those same ideas were creating systems that surpassed anything Council species possessed. She activated the shield generator and watched the energy readings climb to levels that should have been impossible. The prototype held steady. Her team cheered. In 6 months they would have this technology installed on every human warship. Let the Council try to intimidate Earth then. The Vexinar communion faced a different kind of crisis, one that threatened the very foundation of their civilization. For 12,000 years the Vexinar had guided galactic spirituality through their interpretation of the ancient prophecies. These sacred texts described the eternal nature of the galactic community and the unchanging order that bound all civilized species together. The texts spoke of unity, permanence, and the divine structure that ensured peace and prosperity for those who followed the correct path. Then humanity had left the Council, and the prophecies said nothing about such an event. High Priest Velshara spent sleepless weeks studying the ancient texts, searching for some explanation or guidance. The prophecies assumed that all species would remain within the Council framework forever. They assumed that the elder species would maintain their positions of authority eternally. They assumed that the galactic order was as permanent as the stars themselves. None of these assumptions had proven correct. Humanity's departure and the subsequent chaos demonstrated that the prophecies were incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst. Younger Vexinar began questioning everything they had been taught. If the prophecies were wrong about this, what else might they be wrong about? Velshara tried to maintain order, but doubt spread through his communion like a virus. Religious civil war loomed as traditionalists fought with reformers over the true meaning of their faith. Smaller species that the Council had ignored for generations began reaching out to Earth with increasing desperation. The Trill sent a delegation led by Ambassador Kethran to meet with President Helen Carter. Kethran was a young diplomat who had studied human culture extensively. He understood that humans valued directness over elaborate ceremony. He arrived at the presidential residence in Washington and made his case simply. The Trill needed trade partners who would treat them fairly. They needed protection from raiders and pirates. They needed access to medical technology and educational resources. In exchange, they offered friendship, loyalty, and access to Trill star charts that showed safe routes through regions of space that humans had never explored. Helen listened carefully and promised to consider the proposal. Similar delegations arrived from the Morenti, the Halcyon, the Varric, and 24 other species. Each came with their own needs and offers. Helen established a review committee led by Ambassador Kevin Price to evaluate each request. Kevin had been part of the Council delegation before the withdrawal. He understood alien cultures better than most humans. He also understood that Earth could not simply accept every species that asked. Some were too unstable. Others might be Council spies. A few seemed to want human protection without offering anything meaningful in return. Kevin and his team worked methodically through each application, accepting some and politely declining others. The species that were accepted found Earth to be a very different kind of partner than the Council had been. Captain Ben Crawford resumed his trading routes, but now he operated entirely outside Council space. His ship, the Steady Hand, visited Trill colonies, Morenti outposts, and Halcyon settlements. Everywhere he went, people were grateful to see him. They paid fair prices for his goods and treated him with respect. Ben's profit margins actually increased without Council taxes eating into his revenue. He hired a Trill navigator named Sella, who knew routes through asteroid fields that cut travel time by days. His Morenti engineer, Vec, kept the ship's engines running at peak efficiency using techniques that human mechanics had never considered. Ben's mixed crew worked together smoothly, something that would have been impossible under Council species who refused to cooperate with those they considered inferior. Back on Station Harmony, the Galactic Council tried desperately to maintain their authority over a galaxy that was rapidly slipping out of their control. High Chancellor Zorth called emergency session after emergency session, but the results were always the same. Lots of discussion, lots of blame, and no real solutions. The elder species were discovering that problems which humans had solved quietly and efficiently were actually incredibly complex. Restoring the communication network would take years and cost billions. Replacing human medical expertise would require training thousands of new doctors. Repairing the trade systems needed economists who understood modern market theory, not ancient traditions. Finding mediators who could actually resolve conflicts without violence meant changing the entire council approach to diplomacy. Every problem had a solution in theory, but implementing those solutions required resources and expertise that the council did not have. The Zelthari Imperium's military forces were stretched impossibly thin, trying to contain all the conflicts. The Krovan Collective's economy continued to collapse despite their best efforts to repair their systems. The Vexenar communion split into 3 factions that refused to speak to each other. Smaller member species stopped paying their council dues and ignored directives from the central government. Station Harmony experienced its first major technical failure when life support systems in the Western Quadrant malfunctioned. The repair took 3 weeks instead of the 3 hours it would have taken when human technicians were available. 10 council members died from toxic gas exposure before the systems were restored. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The council itself was dying, slowly suffocating on its own arrogance and incompetence. Laura Bennett, now Earth's Secretary of State, received daily reports from intelligence agents embedded throughout council space. The message was consistent across all sources. The council was collapsing. The elder species were finally realizing that humans had not been lucky or impulsive. Humans had been competent, innovative, and genuinely committed to helping others regardless of their status or power. Those qualities had made humanity indispensable to galactic civilization. Without them, the ancient order could not survive. Laura read the reports and felt no satisfaction or joy. She had not wanted the council to fail. She had wanted them to change, but they had refused, and now they were paying the price for their pride. The galaxy was entering a new era, and humanity would help shape it. This time, however, they would do so on their own terms. A full year had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy barely resembled the ordered civilization that had existed before. High Chancellor Zorth sat alone in his private chambers on Station Harmony and stared at the reports covering his desk. The Terminus sector conflict had expanded to involve 8 species now. 42 systems were actively at war. Civilian casualties numbered in the millions. Zelthari battle fleets were losing ships faster than the shipyards could replace them. His military advisors told him they needed human tactical support. His economic counselors told him the Empire was running out of money to fund the war effort. His political allies told him the other council members were preparing to vote him out of power. Zorth had been High Chancellor for 300 years. He had never imagined his reign would end like this. He did something he had sworn never to do. He composed a personal message to President H. Ellen Carter of Earth and sent it through secure diplomatic channels. The message was brief and carefully worded to avoid appearing desperate, though desperation was exactly what he felt. He explained that the current conflicts threatened innocent civilians who had nothing to do with council politics. He suggested that perhaps human military advisors could be contracted to help resolve the situation. Earth would be compensated generously. He did not explicitly ask for help, but the request was obvious between the lines. He sent the message and waited for a response. Helen's reply arrived 3 days later. It was even shorter than his message. She thanked him for thinking of Earth, but explained that humanity's military resources were committed to protecting human systems and their new partners. She wished him luck in resolving the conflicts and hoped that innocent lives would be spared. She did not offer assistance. She did not suggest alternatives. She simply declined and moved on. Zorth read the message 5 times, searching for some opening or opportunity. There was none. Earth had closed the door, and he had no way to open it again. On the frontier, hundreds of smaller civilizations faced existential threats without the protection they had relied upon for decades. The Marenti Collective's homeworld, a planet called Vishara, suffered an outbreak of a plague that their medical science could not identify or treat. The disease spread rapidly through the population centers, killing thousands in the first week. The Marenti government sent desperate messages to every major medical facility in Council space. Most ignored them. The few that responded said they were too busy with their own crises to help a minor species on the far edge of civilized territory. The Marenti were on their own. Dr. Lisa Morgan read the reports about Vishara from her office at the Earth Medical Command Center in Geneva. She had been following the outbreak since the first cases appeared. Her preliminary analysis suggested it was a mutated form of a virus that Earth doctors had encountered before. She believed she could develop a treatment within weeks if she had access to samples and patients. She went straight to President Helen Carter and requested permission to lead a medical mission to Vishara. Helen looked at her with sympathy but shook her head. The Marenti had supported humanity in the Council. That was true. But Earth could not save every species that faced a crisis. Resources were limited. If they helped the Marenti, a dozen other species would immediately request similar assistance. Where would it end? Lisa argued passionately, but Helen remained firm. Earth needed to focus on its own people first. Lisa left the meeting feeling angry and helpless. She understood Helen's reasoning, but she could not accept it. Thousands of Marenti were dying from a disease that she might be able to cure. She spent the next week reviewing every regulation and policy guideline she could find. Finally, she discovered a loophole. Individual citizens could travel to non-allied systems for personal reasons, as long as they did not represent Earth officially. Lisa submitted her resignation from Earth Medical Command and booked passage on a private transport heading toward Marenti space. She would go to Vishara as a private citizen and help however she could. If Helen wanted to stop her, she would have to arrest her. The economic collapse in Council space accelerated beyond anyone's worst predictions. The Krovan Collective's trade network suffered a catastrophic systems failure that shut down commerce across 30 systems for 5 days. When the network finally came back online, it was barely functional. Shipping routes were completely scrambled. Prices bore no relationship to actual supply and demand. Cargo manifests were corrupted or lost entirely. Billions of beings faced shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. The Krovan Chancellor Hevrel appeared on Galactic broadcast to blame human sabotage, insisting that Earth had deliberately destroyed their systems before leaving. Independent investigators found no evidence of sabotage. The truth was simpler and more damning. The systems had simply failed because no one knew how to maintain them properly. In human space, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Scientists worked without the restrictions that Council regulations had imposed for decades. Dr. Nathan Cross and his team at the Luna Research Facility perfected a faster-than-light communication system that operated on principles the Council had declared impossible. Traditional FTL communication required relay stations every few light years. Nathan's system could transmit messages across hundreds of light years without any infrastructure. The first successful test transmitted a message from Earth to the colony on New Vancouver, over 300 light years away, with zero delay. The implications were staggering. Human colonies could now coordinate in real time. Military fleets could communicate instantly across vast distances. Earth had just gained an advantage that no other species possessed. Engineer Claire Thompson led a separate project at the orbital facility above Mars. Her team developed a new fusion reactor design that generated 3 times more power than standard Council reactors, while using half the fuel. The design was elegant and surprisingly simple once you understood the underlying physics. Claire had tried to publish similar research while humanity was still in the Council. The paper had been rejected by every major scientific journal. The reviewers said her theories violated established principles and showed poor understanding of basic fusion mechanics. Now her reactor powered half of Mars Station and proved that the established principles were incomplete. Claire wondered how many other human innovations had been dismissed or suppressed because they challenged Council orthodoxy. The smaller species that had aligned with humanity after the withdrawal were prospering in ways they had never experienced under Council rule. The Trill colonies, now protected by human patrol fleets, had become safe havens for refugees fleeing the chaos in Council space. Captain Kyle Sanders commanded the patrol group responsible for the Trill systems. His ships were smaller and faster than Council vessels, using the new stealth technology that made them nearly impossible to track. Raiders and pirates who had preyed on Trill settlements for years suddenly found themselves outmatched and outgunned. Kyle's crews captured or destroyed a dozen raider ships in the first 6 months. The attacks stopped. The Trill could finally focus on building their civilization instead of constantly defending it. Trade with humanity brought wealth that transformed Trill society. They exported rare minerals that Earth's growing industries needed desperately. In return, they received advanced medical technology, agricultural equipment, and educational resources. Trill students attended universities on Earth and returned home with knowledge that revolutionized entire fields. Ambassador Kethron reported to his government that joining humanity's network was the best decision the Trill had made in 5 centuries. Other species noticed and wanted the same opportunities. High Chancellor Zorith called one more emergency council session. The chamber that had once been filled with confident leaders now held scared and desperate beings. Zorith stood at the center podium and laid out the reality they all faced. The council was dying. Member species were leaving or simply ignoring central authority. The military could not contain the spreading conflicts. The economy was collapsing. Infrastructure was failing. They had 3 choices. They could continue as they were and watch everything fall apart completely. They could dissolve the council and let each species fend for themselves. Or they could admit they had made a terrible mistake and try to negotiate with humanity. The chamber erupted in argument. Some elder species refused to even consider asking humans for help. Their pride would not allow it. Others saw no alternative. The debate raged for hours with no resolution. The Vexinar High Priest Velshara experienced a vision during meditation that changed everything he believed. In the vision, he saw humanity not as disruptive children or dangerous rebels, but as teachers who had been trying to show the elder species a better way. The old prophecies had not failed. They had simply been misunderstood. The eternal galactic community was not meant to be rigid and unchanging. It was meant to evolve and grow, adapting to new circumstances and incorporating new wisdom. Humanity's departure was not the end of galactic civilization. It was the beginning of its transformation into something better. Velshara emerged from his meditation and began teaching this new interpretation to his followers. The Vexinar communion split into factions that argued bitterly over Velshara's teachings. Traditionalists accused him of heresy and corruption by human ideas. Reformers embraced his vision and demanded that the communion reach out to Earth for guidance. The split threatened to become violent until Velshara himself intervened. He challenged the traditionalists to explain the current chaos using the old prophecies. If the texts were complete and correct, they should provide answers. The traditionalists could not respond. The galaxy was entering uncharted territory that the ancient texts had never imagined. Slowly, painfully, the communion began to accept that perhaps their understanding had been incomplete all along. Laura Bennett sat in her office at the State Department building in Washington and reviewed intelligence summaries from across the galaxy. Every report told the same story from different angles. The council was collapsing under the weight of its own failures. Species were learning that the elder races had no special wisdom, just ancient pride. Systems that had operated for millennia were breaking down without human maintenance and innovation. The rigid hierarchy that had seemed eternal was proving to be fragile and temporary. Laura had not wanted this outcome. She had hoped the council would recognize its mistakes and reform itself. Instead, they had doubled down on their arrogance until reality forced them to face the truth. She opened a new report from Agent Marcus Webb, embedded deep in council territory. Marcus reported increasing numbers of individual council species reaching out quietly to human contacts. Not official government delegations, but military officers, scientists, engineers, and bureaucrats who saw the writing on the wall. They offered information, assistance, and cooperation in exchange for access to human technology and protection. Some were genuine. Others were likely spies or opportunists. Webb recommended a cautious but open approach. These individuals might become the foundation of a new galactic order, built on cooperation rather than domination. President Helen Carter called a meeting of her senior advisors to discuss the situation. Admiral Chris Walker, Laura Bennett, Secretary of Defense Ryan Foster and a dozen others gathered in the Situation Room deep beneath the White House. Helen asked each of them for recommendations. Chris suggested expanding the human defensive perimeter and accepting more species into their protection network. Laura advocated for humanitarian missions to assist species facing genuine crises. Ryan warned against overextending Earth's resources too quickly. Others offered their own perspectives. Helen listened to all of them and then made her decision. Earth would not rush to fill the power vacuum left by the Council. They would not become the new overlords of the galaxy. Instead, they would build something different, something better, something that honored the principles humanity had always claimed to value. It would take time and patience, but the opportunity was there. The galaxy was ready for change whether the elder species admitted it or not. 18 months after humanity left the Galactic Council, the announcement came through every communication channel in civilized space. The Galactic Council was officially dissolved. High Chancellor Zorath appeared on screens across hundreds of worlds to make the declaration. His voice held none of its former authority or pride. He simply stated the facts. The Council could no longer fulfill its mandate to maintain peace and prosperity. Member species had lost faith in the central government. The elder species would retreat to their core territories and focus on their own populations. The great experiment in galactic unity that had lasted 10,000 years was over. Zorath offered no apologies and made no excuses. He simply ended the broadcast and disappeared from public view. Historians would later note that he looked like a being who had aged centuries in less than 2 years. President Helen Carter watched the broadcast from the Oval Office with her closest advisors gathered around her. The room remained silent for several minutes after Zorath's image faded from the screen. Admiral Jake Morrison was the first to speak. He suggested this was humanity's moment to step forward and establish dominance over the galactic remnants. Earth had the technology, the military strength, and the moral authority to build an empire that would dwarf what the Council had been. Species across the galaxy were desperate for leadership and would accept human rule gratefully. Jake laid out a strategic plan he had been developing for months. It was comprehensive, logical, and completely contrary to everything humanity claimed to believe. Helen listened to Jake's entire proposal without interrupting. When he finished, she thanked him for his thorough analysis and then rejected every element of it. She reminded everyone in the room why humanity had left the Council in the first place. They had been tired of being dominated by species who claimed superiority. They had been frustrated by a system that valued ancient privilege over current merit. They had been angry at leaders who made decisions without considering the needs of smaller or weaker populations. If Earth simply replaced the Council with a human empire, they would become everything they had opposed. The people in the room exchanged glances. Some looked relieved, others looked disappointed, but no one argued with Helen's logic. 3 days later, Earth broadcast its own announcement to the galaxy. President Helen Carter stood before cameras and spoke directly to billions of beings across hundreds of species. She acknowledged the fall of the Galactic Council and the chaos that had followed. She recognized that many civilizations were struggling and afraid. Then she presented Earth's vision for the future. Humanity proposed the creation of a new organization called the Free Systems Alliance. Unlike the Council, membership would be completely voluntary. Unlike the Council, every member species would have equal voting rights regardless of age or military power. Unlike the Council, the alliance would be built on cooperation and mutual benefit rather than domination and exploitation. The charter would emphasize shared innovation, collective defense, and respect for each species' sovereignty. Any civilization could join if they agreed to these basic principles and committed to peaceful cooperation with other members. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, 40 species formally requested membership in the Free Systems Alliance. The Trill were first, with Ambassador Kethran personally delivering their application to Earth. The Morenti followed, grateful beyond words after Dr. Lisa Morgan had arrived on their homeworld as a private citizen and developed a cure for the plague that had killed thousands. Lisa had worked around the clock for 3 weeks, training Morenti doctors in treatment protocols and establishing quarantine procedures. She had saved millions of lives and asked for nothing in return. The Morenti government declared her a planetary hero and immediately petitioned to join any organization that Earth led. The Halcyon, Varric, Shen, and dozens of minor species that had suffered under council neglect all submitted applications. Even some former council members humbled by recent events requested consideration for membership. The Krovan Collective's new Chancellor Mervala was among them. She was young for a Krovan leader, barely 200 years old, and represented a generation that had grown tired of the old ways. Mervala traveled to Earth personally to meet with President Helen Carter. The summit lasted 3 days and covered everything from trade regulations to mutual defense agreements to shared scientific research. Mervala admitted that the Krovan had been wrong about humanity. They had dismissed human contributions and stolen human innovations while claiming superiority. She could not undo the past, but she could commit to a better future. The Krovan Collective would join the Free Systems Alliance if Earth would accept them. In return, they would share their remaining trade infrastructure and accept human advisors to help rebuild their economic systems properly. Helen agreed, but with conditions. The Krovan would need to demonstrate genuine change in how they treated smaller species. No more exploitation or dismissal of those deemed inferior. Mervala accepted the terms without hesitation. Her people were starving and desperate. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. Dr. Lisa Morgan finally received official authorization to lead humanitarian missions to species in genuine need. President Helen had initially resisted such missions out of concern for overextending Earth's resources. But Lisa's success on the Marenti homeworld had demonstrated that strategic assistance could transform entire civilizations and build lasting goodwill. The medical teams that Lisa organized over the following months saved countless lives and established Earth's reputation not as conquerors, but as partners who genuinely cared about all species. Engineers repaired critical infrastructure on dozens of worlds that lacked the technical expertise to fix failing systems. Agricultural specialists helped colonies improve crop yields and prevent famines. Teachers trained local populations in everything from basic literacy to advanced quantum mechanics. The Zelthari Imperium remained isolated and proud, even as their empire crumbled around them. General Kravik, the same officer who had tried to prevent Commander Paul Newman from leaving Firebase Delta, watched his civilization decline with growing frustration. The Zelthari military was stretched impossibly thin. Their economy was collapsing. Their colonies were rebelling or simply declaring independence. The civilian population was losing faith in the old leadership. Kravik was not a politician or a diplomat. He was a soldier who valued effectiveness over tradition. He made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. He contacted Paul Newman directly through back channels and asked for a meeting. They met on a neutral station in unclaimed space. Kravik came alone without any official authorization from his government. He told Paul that the Zelthari Empire was dying because its leaders refused to adapt. But individual Zelthari commanders saw the truth. They needed help, and pride was worthless to dead civilizations. Kravik offered intelligence about remaining threats in the region, access to Zelthari medical research that could benefit multiple species, and the cooperation